The debut album by Oasis, Definitely Maybe, was the perfect storm of indie rock coupled with melodic pop sensibilities, and crucially delivered with a swagger and personality that was infectious, helping kickstart a whole movement in the UK that became known as Britpop. Things could have been very different though, with the band's initial attempts at recording the album being not far short of a complete disaster. With the recordings sounding lifeless and unrepresentative of the band they were live, which was very much in your face, loud and brash. These initial album sessions took place at Mono Valley Studios, led by producer Dave Batchelor, whom Noel had known for a while by this stage, from his time working with the Inspiral Carpets. The engineer was Dave Scott, who'd actually worked with Oasis since before Noel and Liam were even in the band. The 2 days were employed separately, and tensions appeared quickly, as Dave Batchelor, feeling as though he should have been given the chance to choose his engineer himself. Their other issues could probably be put down to their studio naivety, despite having some previous experience recording with the Real People at their studio in Liverpool and at Out of the Blue Studios in Manchester. The track Columbia was the fruit of their collaboration with the Real People, a tune heavily inspired by the acid house days of the Hacienda. In fact, the main riff and chord sequence can clearly be heard in the 1991 release Axe Corner by Tortuga. The song and recording is definitely a huge nod to the more psychedelic baggy scene, with random samples peppering the track. The Out of the Blue sessions in February '93 gave the album the backing track to Shaker Maker, with overdubs being performed later, including new vocals with rewritten lyrics. Dave Batchelor preferred to record the band separately, as opposed to a more natural live band approach that they were used to. Not only did this throw them off their game as musicians, it also created a sound that was very separated, with very little ambience and overall energy. It was clear to the band and everyone around them that it wasn't working, and things came to a head when Dave Batchelor was insisting that Slide Away should be at a much slower tempo than it was written. Dave Scott believed this was wrong, and proceeded to record it faster, as Noel had written it. This led to Batchelor firing Scott, and shortly after, Noel firing Batchelor, and putting a stop to the sessions that were costing £800 a day. Interestingly, this recording of Slide Away ended up on the album, the only one to survive these Mono Valley sessions. According to Noel, the song was written on a 1960 Gibson Les Paul that Johnny Marr had sent him to use as an alternative to his Epiphone Les Paul. Noel has stated that he mostly used the Gibson from that point on, although the comparatively inexpensive Epiphone does appear on the album and can be seen in the studio on many photographs. His amp setup at the time was the same as used for live performances. Again, this was a relatively inexpensive rig featuring a Marshall Valve State 8080 and a WEM Dominator Mark III. The Valve States featured a tube preamp into a solid-state power section, with the WEM being all tube. The combination of these two amps provided Noel's tone for the majority of the album, with the only other addition to his chain being a Roland Space Echo. Bonehead's rig was his Epiphone Riviera into a Marshall, while Gweezy used a Fender Jazz Bass into a Hiwatt Custom 200, with a DI taken also. With the Mono Valley sessions now being aborted, their record label Creation remained patient, but they were also keen to get a single out at least, with the band entering the Pink Museum studio in Liverpool. Dave Scott was back on hand to engineer, but production duties were now in the hands of Noel and the band's live sound engineer Mark Coyle. Although it's worth noting that the Real People's Griffiths brothers were on hand to guide them once again. They intended to get some potential songs together for a first single. Dave Scott remembers that they were attempting I Will Believe, with Noel remembering Bring It On Down. Either way, it wasn't going well. Legend has it that while the band regrouped to think about what to do, with the time running out and fearing a grilling from Creation for wasting more time, they ordered a Chinese takeaway, and during the wait, Noel wrote Supersonic and got on with recording it immediately. With not much known about the recording setup in terms of microphones for the subsequent main album recording, the setup for Supersonic may give us some insight, as Dave Scott recalls recording the guitar amps with a Shure SM57 close-up, coupled with a Neumann U87 about 8 feet away. Apparently it was done in such haste, with no intention of it being a finished version, that it was mixed down onto a domestic quality DAT machine via several meters of unbalanced cheap cable with RCA connectors, and to cassette, which apparently sounded better. Nonetheless, everyone loved it, and it was penciled in for release with no changes or overdubs. Going back to Noel's memory about them failing to nail Bring It On Down, This was all down to his displeasure at Tony McCarroll's attempt to play the Pound in Tom section of the song. Playing his Pearl Export drum kit with Pearl Master's maple snare, apparently Tony simply couldn't get what Noel wanted, to the extent that Noel actually hired in a session drummer to do it instead. In the end, Tony did get it down, but pretty much at the last minute, and at the final recording sessions at Eden Studios. With the band still needing to record some of the album's key songs, such as Rock and Roll Star and Live Forever, they headed off to Sawmill Studio, Cornwall, to have another proper crack at recording the album. Again, Noel and Mark Coyle were officially in charge as producers, although this time, Creation made sure they had one of their trusted engineers present, Angela Dutt. This time the band recorded live, with some separation to allow easier mixing, but essentially having eye contact and playing the songs as a collective. This put the band at ease and allowed them to enjoy the process and deliver better performances in general. Another key difference to the approach was Noel's more is more philosophy of guitar overdubs. Probably in a reaction to the sparseness of the first recordings, Noel was keen to layer many different guitars onto the initial live band recordings in order to fill out the sound and effectively create a wall of guitars. Despite having free rein to record as they liked, it was still apparent that they weren't quite there still in terms of the overall sound, and Creation even outright rejected these first mixes. You can hear some of these recordings on a YouTube video called Whitfield Street Sessions.
I don't really wanna know how your garden grows.
This really provides an insight into what an appropriate mix and master can bring to the table. In the end, the whole thing was ultimately saved by Owen Morris. Owen had been working with Johnny Marr for some time at this point, so had met Noel before, but it was actually their manager Marcus Russell that contacted Owen and asked him to save the sessions, giving him carte blanche to do whatever he liked in order to get the songs to the point where they could be released. This did involve a lot of vocal overdubs, which was crucial, but also a whole bag of mixing tricks. Of course, Owen did end up saving the sessions, and gave Oasis a sound that they'd been searching for all along. Here's what Owen said on the mixing and mastering process. A week or two before the weekend mixing Rock and Roll Star in Columbia, I'd been reading an article on Phil Spector's production of Instant Karma. One of the things that interested me was his use of in-time tape delays on the drums. Also, I'd been reading about Tony Visconti's discovery of the Eventide harmonizer on the David Bowie Berlin sessions, and specifically, how Visconti would use a regenerated pitch change on the drums to cause a fall in deepening effect. So on Tony's drums, I set up a big regenerated tape delay with eighth notes, which subliminally added groove and offbeats. Then I added the Visconti harmonizer trick to the snare to add subliminal depth and rhythm. I heavily compressed the overall drum sound, squeezing it so every hit was the same. I'd also programmed a tambourine to play along with the snare drum when I felt it helped. Anything to make the rhythm track exciting and grooving. The most obvious use of tape delay trick can be heard on Columbia, where the actual recording of the drums and bass is just doing 4 beats in a bar. I doubled up the bass drum, snare and bass guitar to create the 8 beats in a bar, faster pumping rhythm. Here's my attempt to show this in Pro Tools. I built up a wall of guitars with a simple drum beat, adding some delays to create that groove. I've also overlaid the tambourine and the audio damage Discord to do the Eventide trick. I put the bass guitar through a mini Moog synthesizer and used the filter section to take off all the top end. This was necessary and successful because it took away the hits of the notes and therefore hid the imprecise playing. Then on the guitars, I used 4 different types of outboard special processing I'd learnt from Bernard's treatment of his keyboard sounds. This featured some modulation effects and stereo spread with phase programs. I'd also use a small reverb and a large hall-type reverb. Then I compressed the overall mix very heavily, more than normally would be considered professional. I would also vary speed of tape, usually speeding up the track slightly to a place where it felt more exciting. I'd always be running my computer sequencer alongside as well, and add subsonic low sine waves to subliminally add weight to the sound. I'd also use a combination of all these effects on Liam's vocals. There's other stuff I'd use to get Liam's vocal sound as well, but that's a secret. This secret could be tuning, as Owen used the Eventide DSP 4000 for this purpose on the next album. The unit was released in '94, so it is possible. I then got to master the album by myself, without some bored by-the-book mastering engineer who didn't get it. I mastered the album at Johnny Marr's studio, and I remember that Johnny was appalled of how in-your-face the whole thing was. He thought I was an idiot for what he perceived were mistakes, like the noise at the front of cigarettes and alcohol. The Smiths would have never been so crude. One of the key pieces of gear Owen used for mastering was the Apogee soft limit feature on their AD500 analog to digital converter. The soft limit was there to prevent harsh sounding digital clipping. However, when pushed, it could make the limiter work harder, squashing any peaks down and thus making the overall sound appear louder. This meant that the album really sprung out when listened to on jukeboxes or at home on a CD. It was also useful to suppress any transient that might expose any out of time playing, which was something Owen was keen to mask. The album was finally released in August '94 and went on to become a massive hit and set Oasis on a path to becoming the biggest band in the UK. But when you look back at its difficult birth, had they released the first version, history could have turned out very differently.